The moment didn't begin with a speech. It began with a clink. A champagne flute tapping against crystal, the kind of polite summons that gathers attention without demanding it. I was standing near the bay window of my grandfather's sunroom, the late afternoon light catching dust motes like suspended gold, when my cousin Lee raised her glass and said, "To Grandpa, our family's rock, and the only reason a leaner," finally on solid ground. Everyone turned, smiles bloomed, someone murmured, "Amen." And there he sat, Grandpa at the head of the mahogany table, crisp white shirt, silver pocket watch gleaming, beaming like a king surveying his loyal court. He reached over and patted my hand, his knuckles papery but firm. "All she needed," he said, voice warm with pride, "was a little guidance, a steady hand." That's when it happened. Not a flash of anger, not a surge of tears, but a deep, quiet click inside my chest, like a lock turning after years of rust. Because in that moment, I saw the whole room through two lenses at once. On the surface, a birthday celebration, generational love, a patriarch honored for his generosity. Beneath it, a carefully curated narrative built on documents I'd spent 18 months unearthing, bank statements I'd cross-referenced at 2 a.m., and a $47,328 debt trail that bore my name, but not my consent. I didn't move right away. I let the applause ripple. I let him bask. Because I understood now, this wasn't just a toast. It was a performance, and I'd been cast as the grateful, rescued girl for the last time. I set my fork down, not dramatically, just deliberately. The soft clatter against the china cut through the chatter like a needle through silk. Then I stepped forward, heels silent on the Persian rug, and stood beside his chair. The room hushed, sensing a continuation, a thank you speech, perhaps. Even Grandpa tilted his head up at me, eyes crinkling with expectation. I leaned down slightly, close enough that only he would catch the tremor in my voice before it steadied. "You know what, Grandpa?" I said, voice clear, calm, carrying just enough to reach the back row. "I've been going through the records, and I realized something important." A pause, just long enough for confusion to flicker across his face. "Your help didn't put me on solid ground," I continued. "It buried me under $47,000 in debt, on accounts I never authorized, with signatures I never gave. So thank you for finally giving me a reason to get the truth notarized." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, the kind of quiet that swallows breath and echoes with everything left unsaid for years. My aunt dropped her napkin. My cousin froze mid-sip. And Grandpa, he didn't look angry. He looked startled, like someone who just realized the script had changed and he wasn't holding the pen anymore. But I wasn't done. Because truth, once spoken in a room built on fiction, doesn't just hang in the air. It settles, and I had receipts to prove it. If you've ever sat across from someone who called their control care, or watched them reframe your dependence as their generosity, you know that particular kind of loneliness. It's not the absence of people, it's the absence of being seen. For years, I thought I was the problem. Too naive, too trusting, too soft to manage my own life without a guiding hand. That's what they told me anyway. That's what Grandpa told me every time he slid another agreement across the table with a smile and a, "Don't worry, sweetheart, I've got you covered." But here's what I've learned since then, and what I need you to hear if you're watching this. Being kind doesn't make you a doormat. Being grateful doesn't mean you owe your autonomy. And help that comes with hidden terms isn't help at all. It's a transaction disguised as love. I'm telling this story not because I want revenge, but because I want to break the spell. So many of us, especially women, especially the responsible ones, the quiet ones, the ones who show up with soup when someone's sick and never miss a birthday, get quietly absorbed into other people's narratives. We become supporting characters in our own lives. And when we finally speak up, we're called ungrateful, dramatic, or confused. If that's you, if you've ever been made to feel small while someone else took up all the space, I see you. And I need you to do something simple right now. Drop a comment below, just a word, a symbol, a me too. Because isolation thrives in silence and truth spreads through shared recognition. You don't have to name names, you don't have to give details, but if this story flickers something in your chest, a memory, a pattern, a question you've been too afraid to ask, say it here. You're not imagining it. And you're not alone. This isn't just about my grandfather. It's about every family where love comes with ledgers. Where I'm doing this for your own good is code for I need you to need me. And it's about what happens when the good girl finally reads the fine print and realizes she was never borrowing kindness. She was collateral. I'll walk you through exactly how it unfolded, the documents, the denials, the quiet turning points that led to that moment in the sunroom. But more than that, I'll show you how I rebuilt, not with bitterness, but with boundaries. And how I learned that the most powerful thing you can say to someone who's rewritten your story is, "Let me tell you what actually happened." So stay with me, because this isn't just my reckoning. It might be yours, too. Grandpa's house wasn't just a home. It was a museum of curated legacy. Every room hummed with the low, polished dignity of old money and older manners. The entryway smelled faintly of lemon oil and pipe tobacco, a scent so familiar it used to calm me the moment I crossed the threshold. Now, it makes my shoulders tense. The living room was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, none of the books ever read, just neatly aligned leather spines stamped with gold, like props in a period piece about benevolence. The sunroom, where we held birthdays and funerals alike, had wicker furniture cushioned in cream linen that somehow never stained, no matter how many generations spilled wine or tears into its fibers. But it was the study that held the truth. Tucked behind a pair of sliding oak doors, always slightly ajar during family visits but never fully open, it was Grandpa's command center. A mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface immaculate except for a brass ledger, thick, bound in green cloth, corners worn smooth from decades of use. He'd tap it when discussing family matters, saying things like, "It's all accounted for in here," as if that made it sacred. I used to think it was a record of generosity, who he'd helped when, how much, a chronicle of kindness. Now I know better. That ledger wasn't a log of gifts, it was a balance sheet of obligation. Every act of support was entered not as grace, but as debt. My college tuition, coded E2014, loan W implied repayment via loyalty. My car after the accident, E2017, assets secured under G's trust. Even the rent he covered during my residency was listed as E2019, temporary housing advance, expect reciprocal care post-retirement. He never showed me the pages. He didn't have to. The expectation lived in his voice, in the way he'd sigh when I missed a Sunday dinner, in the pointed questions about my career choices. After everything I've invested. To the outside world, the neighbors, the country club, even most of our family, I was the lucky granddaughter. The one Grandpa took under his wing. The one he saved from financial ruin after my parents' messy divorce. They'd nod knowingly when he mentioned my rough start, as if my life were a rescue mission he'd heroically completed. And I played my part, smiling in photos, writing thank you notes in neat cursive, never contradicting him in public. Because to do so would have been to admit I hadn't been rescued at all. I'd been quietly collateralized. The windows in that house were always clean, always open just a crack to let in fresh air. But they never offered a true view out. They reflected back what Grandpa wanted us to see: order, stability, a family held together by his steady hand. It took me years to realize I wasn't looking through glass. I was looking into a mirror, one he'd carefully angled to show me only my dependence, never my worth apart from it. And yet even now I can't deny the beauty of the place. The way afternoon light slants through the bay window, turning dust into gold. The weight of the crystal doorknobs. The quiet hum of a house that's known only one master for 50 years. That's the tragedy of it. The cage was gilded, yes, but it was still a cage. And the ledger on that desk, it wasn't just keeping score. It was deciding my future, one coded entry at a time. It started, like so many slow betrayals do, with something that felt like salvation. I was 19, rattled by my parents' divorce, working double shifts at a coffee shop while trying to pass community college finals, and sleeping on a friend's pull-out couch because my share of the apartment rent had vanished with my dad's sudden move to another state. I hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. My student loan application had been denied for lack of a cosigner. And then Grandpa called. "Pack your things, Alina," he said, voice gentle but firm, like he was plucking a stray thread from a fine suit. "You'll stay with me, and don't worry about school, I'll handle the tuition." I cried in the parking lot of the grocery store where I'd been bagging apples for spare change. Not just from relief, from awe. Here was the patriarch, the steady hand I'd heard about in family lore since childhood, stepping in like a character from a novel. He drove me home in his vintage Lincoln, helped me carry my duffel bag up the front steps, and showed me to the guest room that would become my home for the next 12 years. That night, over chicken pot pie and iced tea, he slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "Just sign here," he said. "It's nothing, just so the school knows I'm backing you. A formality." I signed without reading it, not out of laziness, out of trust, out of exhaustion, out of the desperate belief that someone finally saw me not as a burden, but as someone worth investing in. That signature, it turned out, was the first brick in a wall I didn't know was being built around me. Over the years, Grandpa's help became a rhythm I learned to move to. Need a car. He'd take me to the dealership, charm the sales manager, and co-sign on the spot. "Family takes care of family," he'd say, patting my shoulder as I handed over my learner's permit. Need an apartment closer to my grad school campus. He'd wire the deposit, then casually mention that since he was on the lease, I should probably keep the utilities in his name for tax simplicity. Need emergency surgery after a hiking accident. He covered the deductible, then gently reminded me over hospital jello that medical debt follows you forever. Good thing I stepped in. Each time it felt like rescue. Each time it came with a document I barely glanced at, a clause buried in legalese, a verbal assurance that it's all just paperwork. I was too tired, too grateful, too conditioned to question the man who'd plucked me from the gutter of my early adulthood. I mistook his involvement for love, his oversight for care. But the imbalance wasn't just emotional, it was structural. Grandpa didn't just offer support, he engineered dependency. The real risk became clear the day I tried to apply for a mortgage on my own at 31. I had a stable job, clean credit, or so I thought, and a down payment saved from years of overtime. But the loan officer frowned at her screen, then turned to me with a look I'd never seen before, pity mixed with caution. "Miss Carter," she said softly, "you're listed as a co-borrower on 5 active credit instruments tied to your grandfather's trust. One of them, a home equity line, is 90 days past due. And there's a lien attached to your social for an unpaid promissory note from 2019. I stared at her, heart hammering. That's impossible. I never signed a promissory note, and I've never had access to any trust accounts. She tapped a few keys. According to the filings, you authorized it via wet signature on March 14, 2019, in his study, notarized by a local attorney. March 14, 2019. The day I'd had my appendix removed. I'd been under anesthesia at 10 a.m. The signature was a forgery, not a perfect one, but good enough to pass a cursory bank review. In that moment, the whole edifice cracked. What I'd believed was a safety net was, in fact, a snare. Grandpa hadn't been holding me up, he'd been holding me down. And now, with my own future on the line, I realized the stakes weren't just emotional. They were legal, financial, existential. If I didn't untangle this web, I'd never own a home, never build true credit, never step fully into my own life. The house I thought was my sanctuary had become the place where my autonomy had been quietly auctioned off, one gift at a time. I didn't go to Aunt Miriam right away. In fact, I almost didn't go at all. After the mortgage denial, I spent 3 days in a fog, cycling between rage, shame, and disbelief. Part of me still wanted to believe there been a mistake, a clerical error, a mix-up in the system. Maybe Grandpa had signed something in my name by accident. Maybe the notary had misfiled the date. I even rehearsed a gentle conversation in my head. "Grandpa, I think there's been a misunderstanding about those accounts." But deep down, I knew. The pattern was too consistent, the paper trail too deliberate. And the thought of confronting him alone, of walking into that study with its green ledger and mahogany walls, asking him to explain why my name was on debts I never incurred, made my stomach knot with dread. Then, on a rainy Thursday, I found myself parked outside a quiet bungalow on the edge of town. White picket fence, hydrangeas in bloom, a silver-blue Prius in the driveway. Aunt Miriam's place. She was Grandpa's younger sister, 89, sharp as a scalpel, and the only person in the family who'd ever looked at me like I was more than just Alina the project. I hadn't seen her in years. Grandpa had gently discouraged visits, calling her bitter and out of touch. But I remembered her from childhood. The aunt who gave me books instead of candy, who asked about my opinions, not just my grades. I knocked, hands trembling. She opened the door in a lavender cardigan, eyes widening just slightly before she pulled me into a hug that smelled like lavender soap and Earl Grey. No questions, just warmth. Over tea at her kitchen table, real china mismatched, full of character, I laid it out, not dramatically. Just fact by fact, the cosign loans I'd never seen, the forged promissory note, the bank accounts I was listed on without consent, the mortgage denial. I even brought printouts, blurry, yes, but legible enough. I expected skepticism. At her age, some people retreat into nostalgia, rewriting family history to keep the peace. But Miriam didn't flinch. She adjusted her reading glasses, studied the documents with the focus of someone who'd spent decades reviewing legal briefs, and then looked up at me with eyes that held both sorrow and steel. "Oh, Alina," she said quietly, "he's done this before." My breath caught. She didn't say it with malice. She said it like someone nomming a weather pattern, inevitable, cyclical, known to those who'd lived through it. "Back in '98, she continued, "he helped your cousin Daniel buy his first business, co-signed everything. 6 months later, Daniel was bankrupt and Grandpa owned the building. He called it damage control. But Daniel never recovered his credit, never started another venture." She paused, stirring her tea slowly. "And in 2005, he set up a family education fund for your mother's side. Required everyone to contribute. When your uncle couldn't keep up, Grandpa quietly absorbed his stake. Called it stewardship." I sat there stunned. It wasn't just me. It was a pattern, a system. Then she reached into the drawer beside her and pulled out a manila envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges. "I've kept this for years," she said, sliding it across the table. "After your grandmother passed, I found it in her sewing box. Written it the week before she died. She knew, Alina. She saw what he was doing, and she was afraid for you." Inside was a single sheet of stationery in Grandma's looping cursive. "If Robert is managing Alina's finances, she needs to see the original agreements, not the summaries he gives her. He rewrites the terms. I've seen it. Don't trust the ledger. Trust the bank." Beneath it was a list of account numbers, dates, and names of notaries. Grandma's secret archive. In that moment, something inside me shifted from panic to purpose. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't ungrateful. And I wasn't alone. Aunt Miriam didn't just believe me. She'd been waiting for someone to ask. And now, with Grandma's note in my hand and Miriam's quiet certainty anchoring me, I had something far more powerful than anger. I had validation from the two women who knew him best and loved me enough to tell the truth. The first receipt didn't arrive in a manila envelope or with a lawyer's letterhead. It came in the form of a crumpled thermal slip, tucked into the back of an old planner I'd used during grad school, a planner I'd nearly thrown out during a spring cleaning spree, if not for the stubborn habit of hoarding, just in case mementos. It was faded, the ink bleeding slightly where coffee had once splashed, but the numbers were still legible. October 12, 2018, 12,500. Transaction type, external transfer, authorized by primary account holder. From Alina Carter. To Robert Alden Trust, discretionary fund. I stared at it, heart thudding against my ribs. I remembered that day vividly, not because of any transfer, but because it was the day I'd finally passed my clinical licensing exam. I'd called Grandpa from the parking lot of the testing center, breathless with relief, and he'd said, "That calls for a celebration. I'll wire your tuition reimbursement later this week. Consider it a gift for all your hard work." I thanked him, touched by the gesture. But this receipt told a different story. There was no gift notation, no celebratory memo, just a cold, automated line item labeled authorized by primary account holder, a designation I'd never been granted. That's when I remembered the car loan. 2 months earlier, Grandpa had helped me buy a used sedan after my old one broke down. We'd gone to a local credit union he favored, and he'd sat beside me as the loan officer explained the terms. I'd been exhausted, overwhelmed by residency rotations, and barely registered the stack of documents he handed me to sign. But one clause, buried near the end under administrative provisions, granted the cosigner temporary override authority for account reconciliation and debt offset in the event of borrower default or financial instability. At the time, I'd skimmed it, assuming it was standard boilerplate. But now, cross-referencing the date of that loan signing with this bank slip, the truth clicked into place with chilling clarity. Grandpa hadn't reimbursed me. He'd used a clause in a vehicle loan, a loan I'd only needed because my previous car had been repossessed due to a missed payment he'd promised to cover, to legally siphon money from my account into his trust. It wasn't theft in the cinematic sense, no masked figures, no broken locks. It was cleaner than that, more insidious. He used the system, my trust, my signature, my exhaustion, to make the transfer appear legitimate. And because I'd never monitored that joint checking account closely, why would I? It was just for car payments. I'd missed it for years. But this little slip, this fragile, coffee-stained piece of proof, was enough to plant a seed of certainty. It wasn't just my word against his anymore. There was a timestamp, an account trail, a paper fingerprint. I tucked it into a new folder I'd started, a simple manila binder with a label, financial clarification. Not revenge, not exposé, just clarification. Because at this stage, I wasn't trying to burn the house down. I was trying to find the blueprint beneath the wallpaper. And this receipt, small as it was, proved the house wasn't built the way Grandpa said it was. I didn't confront him that day. I didn't post it online or show it to the family. I sat at my kitchen table, the slip resting on my palm like a shard of broken glass, and made a decision. I would trace every transaction. I would request every disclosure. I would follow the money not with rage, but with the quiet, relentless precision of an archivist restoring a corrupted manuscript. Because if one receipt existed, there were others. And if there were others, then the whole story could be rewritten, this time with my hand on the pen. Confronting him felt like the only honest next step. I told myself I'd be calm, measured, just present the facts, show him the bank slip, and ask for an explanation. Maybe, I thought foolishly, it really was a misunderstanding. Maybe the account had been mislabeled. Maybe he'd meant to reimburse me, but the bank processed it wrong. I wanted to believe that, not because I was naive, but because the alternative, that the man who'd raised me like a second father had been quietly eroding my financial future for over a decade, was too heavy to carry alone. I waited until a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the house was empty except for us. I found him in the study, of course, the green ledger open before him like an altar. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, stripping the desk in gold and shadow. He looked up, smiling faintly. "Eleanor, just the person I was thinking about. I was reviewing the trust distributions. You'll be happy to know your share is still intact." I didn't sit. I stood near the door, folder in hand, and laid the thermal slip on the edge of his desk. "Grandpa," I said, voice steadier than I felt, "can you explain this transfer from my account to your trust in 2018? I never authorized it." For a heartbeat, his expression didn't change. Then, slowly, the smile faded, not into anger, into something colder. Disappointment laced with condescension. "Is this what this is about?" he asked, sighing as if I'd interrupted a generous act with pettiness. "Eleanor, you know how these systems work. The bank auto-processed it because of the cosign agreement. It was just housekeeping. I put it right back into your education fund." "There is no education fund," I said quietly. "And the car loan agreement never gave you access to my personal checking account. That transfer came from my primary account, the one I use for rent and groceries." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "After everything I've done for you," he said, voice low and measured, "you're going to question a clerical detail you think I'd take from you. I built your stability." And that's when he pivoted, not with an apology, not with clarification, but with threat. "You know," he added, almost casually, "the Hendersons were just asking about you at the club last week. Said they heard you've been struggling financially. I told them you were fine, thanks to me. But if you keep chasing shadows, Eleanor, people might start to wonder if you're as reliable as I've always claimed." My stomach dropped. The Hendersons were old family friends, also major donors to the hospital where I worked. If Grandpa started planting seeds about my instability, it could cost me more than reputation. It could cost me my job. As if on cue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A notification from my credit monitoring app, new hard inquiry detected. Institution, First Metro Lending. I hadn't applied for anything, but I knew who had. Grandpa had been trying to refinance one of his properties, and if he listed me as a co-applicant again without consent, it would drag my score down further. Two pressures, closing in at once. The emotional blackmail of familial shame, and the tangible, ticking damage to my financial future. And in that moment, I realized something critical. Talking to him wasn't going to fix this. He wasn't operating from a place of oversight or error. He was operating from control. And control doesn't negotiate, it escalates. I left the study without another word, but I didn't leave defeated. Because as I walked down the hall, folder clutched to my chest, I made a silent vow. No more private conversations. No more trusting his version of reality. If he wanted to play in the shadows, I'd bring in the light. And the light, I now knew, came in the form of official records, third-party verification, and legal paper trails that couldn't be charmed away with a sigh and a sad smile. That night, I sat at my laptop and did something I should have done years ago. I filed a formal dispute with the 3 major credit bureaus. And then, with Aunt Miriam's guidance, I drafted a request to the county bank regulator for a full audit of every joint financial instrument bearing my name and his. Because if he wanted a war of narratives, I'd give him one built not on emotion, but on evidence. And evidence, unlike family loyalty, doesn't bend to charm. The bank didn't invite me into some sleek conference room with bottled water and soft lighting. They brought me to a windowless review suite on the 3rd floor of their corporate branch, a space clearly designed for compliance, not comfort. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The table was laminate, not wood. And the loan officer who met me, a woman named Ms. Tran with a no-nonsense bun and a badge that read Senior Financial Integrity Reviewer, didn't offer pleasantries. She offered a thick manila folder and a single sentence. We've flagged irregularities on 5 instruments tied to your social security number and Mr. Alden's trust. You should see this. My hands were steady as I opened it, but my pulse roared in my ears like ocean surf. Inside were not just summaries, these were the originals, or certified copies at least. Each one stamped, dated, and annotated with red flags from their internal fraud detection team. The first document stopped me cold, a promissory note for $18,000 dated February 2020, listing me as the borrower and Grandpa's trust as the lender. Purpose, personal development grant. But there in the signature block was a name that wasn't mine, close, yes, with similar loops and slants, but the E in a leaner was wrong. I always close mine, this one was open. And the notary seal. From a paralegal who'd been disbarred 2 years prior for notarizing blank documents. The bank had already verified it, forged. The second was worse. A home equity line of credit application from 2021, using my name and Grandpa's house as collateral. I'd never set foot in that mortgage office. But there was my signature, again, a skilled imitation, and a photocopy of my driver's license that had clearly been doctored. The bank's forensic analyst had circled the discrepancies in blue pencil. The expiration date altered, the address changed to match Grandpa's. Then came the liens. 2 vehicle titles, my old sedan and a motorcycle I'd never owned, listed as security against debts I didn't incur. And finally, the master list, a spreadsheet compiled by the bank's compliance team showing every transaction, every inquiry, every account where my identity had been used without verified consent over the past 8 years. The total unauthorized liability, $47,328.29. Not a fortune in Grandpa's world, but enough to wreck my credit, block homeownership, and tether me to him indefinitely. Ms. Tran slid a second envelope across the table. We've issued a formal notice of unauthorized activity, she said, voice low but firm. All joint instruments are frozen pending investigation. We've also filed a suspicious activity report with the state financial regulator and notified the sheriff's civil fraud unit. You're not liable for any of this, but you'll need to file a police report to initiate the credit repair process." I nodded, swallowing hard. This wasn't just validation, it was institutional armor. But the real turning point came when she handed me a third document, a certified letter addressed to Grandpa, signed by the bank's chief compliance officer. It stated plainly that effective immediately, he was barred from initiating any new financial instruments using my name, and that any future attempts would trigger automatic referral to law enforcement. And then, quietly, Ms. Tran added, "We've also notified the county probate court. If he's managing any estate assets with similar tactics, they'll want to know." I left the bank that day not with a swagger, but with a strange, quiet clarity. The fog had lifted. For years, I'd been gaslit into thinking my financial struggles were my own fault, my poor planning, my lack of discipline. But now I held in my hands not just receipts, but official declarations. This was not your failure. This was his design. And with that folder tucked under my arm like a shield, I knew the next meeting wouldn't be in his study. It would be in a room of my choosing, with witnesses, with truth, and with every page of that ledger finally turned to daylight. I didn't send an evite. I didn't make it sound like a confrontation. I called it exactly what it was. A family clarification gathering regarding Grandpa's financial support of a leaner. I sent the invitations by certified mail, copies to all his siblings, his children, my cousins, even the family lawyer who'd handled Grandma's will. I chose the sunroom again, not out of irony, but because it was neutral ground. Bright, open, impossible to dominate with shadows or closed doors. And I scheduled it for a Saturday morning, when people were still clear-headed, before wine or old resentments could blur the lines. I arrived early, not to set up but to breathe. The wisteria outside was in full bloom, purple clusters swaying in the breeze, sunlight dappling the cream linen cushions. It looked peaceful, almost innocent. I arranged a single chair at the head of the table, not for Grandpa, but for me. Then I placed a legal-sized folder in front of it, spine clean, label facing outward. Eleanor Carter, financial record and clarification. Beside it, a printed copy of the bank's notice of unauthorized activity. And next to that, a small framed photo of Grandma, the one where she's laughing, eyes crinkled, holding a teacup like it's a secret she's about to share. I wanted her there, watching. One by one, they arrived. My cousin Lee, still wary since the birthday dinner. Aunt Diane, Grandpa's eldest daughter, arms crossed, lips tight. Even Uncle Paul, who rarely left his vineyard, showed up, brow furrowed in concern. And then Grandpa, dressed in his usual crisp shirt and suspenders, walking in with that slow, assured gait, as if he were still the architect of this family's narrative. He paused when he saw my chair at the head. "Eleanor," he said, voice mild but edged, "what is all this?" "Sit down." "Grandpa," I said, not unkindly. "Everyone, please." When they were settled, some on the wicker love seat, others perched on the edge of chairs, I didn't start with anger. I started with structure. "For the past 18 months, I began, I've been reviewing every financial document that links my name to Grandpa's trust or accounts. I didn't do this out of distrust. I did it because I was denied a mortgage, because my credit score dropped for reasons I couldn't explain, because I kept being told I was lucky to have help while drowning in debt I never agreed to. I opened the folder. I have 5 documents I'd like to share, not to accuse, to clarify. I passed around the first, the bank's fraud determination letter, then the forged promissory note with the analyst's annotations circled in blue, then the home equity application with the altered license. I didn't editorialize, I just let the paper speak. My cousin Daniel, the one Aunt Miriam had mentioned, went pale. "That's the same notary who handled my business loan," he whispered. Grandpa stayed silent, but his fingers, resting on the table, had gone stiff. Then I brought out the ledger, not his green one, but my own. A timeline I'd built, cross-referenced with bank records, credit reports, and Grandma's hidden notes. Each gift he'd announced at holidays or family dinners was matched with a corresponding financial instrument that bound me tighter. Tuition, a co-signed loan with hidden recourse clauses. Car, a lien I never knew existed. Rent, reported to credit bureaus as deferred repayment. When I finished, the room didn't erupt. It contracted. The air grew dense with the weight of realization. Lee looked at Grandpa, eyes wide with something between betrayal and grief. Aunt Diane stared at her hands as if seeing them for the first time. And Grandpa, he didn't deny it. He didn't shout. He just sat there, very still, the way a man does when the foundation beneath him cracks but hasn't yet collapsed. This wasn't a trial. It was a restoration. I wasn't trying to destroy him. I was dismantling the false story so the real one could breathe. And as the silence stretched, I knew the most powerful thing I'd done wasn't showing the receipts. It was giving the family a chance to see the truth, before it was too late to choose a different ending. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth, when backed by paper, speaks in a frequency that cuts through even the thickest denial. After the room had settled into that heavy, stunned quiet, the kind where you can hear someone swallow, I reached into my folder one last time and pulled out 2 sheets of paper. The first was Grandma's letter, the one Aunt Miriam had given me, still in its original envelope, the cursive softened by time but the intent razor-sharp. The second was a notarized affidavit, signed, witnessed, and stamped just 3 days prior, written by Aunt Miriam herself. I unfolded Grandma's letter first. My voice was calm, but it carried, echoing slightly off the sunroom's glass panes. "My dearest Alina," I began, "if you're reading this, it means Robert has once again blurred the line between generosity and control. Do not doubt your instincts. He has always needed to be needed, even if it meant making you need him. I tried to speak up, but he called me sentimental, so I'm writing it down. Trust the banks, not the ledger. And never sign anything without reading it twice. With all my love, M." A soft gasp came from Aunt Diane. She covered her mouth with her hand. Then I turned to Miriam's affidavit. This one wasn't personal, it was forensic. I, Miriam Alden, retired deputy clerk of the county probate court, do hereby affirm that my brother, Robert Alden, has a documented pattern of reclassifying personal loans as gifts for tax and psychological advantage. In 1998, he assumed full ownership of a family business under the guise of bailing out a nephew. In 2005, he absorbed equity shares from relatives during a fabricated family fund crisis. And in 2023, he referenced to me directly his strategy of embedding obligation within generosity to maintain influence over younger family members. I believe his financial involvement with Alina Carter follows this same pattern. I let the words hang. Then I added, "This affidavit has already been filed with the county probate court and shared with the state elder financial abuse task force, not as a criminal complaint, but as a preventative disclosure." Grandpa finally spoke. "You're humiliating me," he said, voice low, strained. "After all I've given." "No, Grandpa," I interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm not humiliating you, I'm correcting the record. You did give me stability. You created dependency and called it love, and that distinction matters not just to me but to everyone in this room who might be next." I turned to the family lawyer, who'd been sitting silently in the corner. "Mr. Ellis, would you confirm what the bank has already determined?" He cleared his throat. "Yes, based on the documentation provided and independently verified by the financial institution, Ms. Carter was listed as a co-borrower or guarantor on multiple instruments without verified consent. Under state law, those obligations are voidable. Furthermore, any asset transfers initiated under forged authorization are legally invalid." Then I did the hardest part. I looked directly at Grandpa. "I don't want to destroy you, but I won't let you rewrite my life anymore. So today, in front of our family, I'm formally disclaiming all financial ties to your trust. I'm filing to have my name removed from every joint account, lien, and instrument, and I'm requesting that any future communication about money go through my attorney." There were tears now in Lee's eyes, in Aunt Diane, even in Uncle Paul. Not tears of anger, but of release. Like a truth long buried had finally been exhumed, and with it, a burden they hadn't realized they'd been carrying too. This wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability. And accountability in a family built on image doesn't need a gavel. It just needs a witness and a paper trail that won't fade. The reversal didn't come with sirens or headlines. It arrived in manila envelopes, stamped with official seals, delivered by couriers who rang the doorbell and waited for a signature. First came the letter from the credit bureaus, Experian, Equifax, TransUnion, each one confirming the removal of every negative mark tied to Grandpa's unauthorized accounts. Per your dispute and supporting documentation, they wrote, the following trade lines have been deleted from your credit file as unverified and potentially fraudulent. My score jumped 82 points overnight, not because I'd done anything new, but because the invisible weight had finally been lifted. Then came the bank's final determination, a thick packet delivered by hand from Ms. Tran herself. Inside was a formal letter stating that all 5 contested instruments had been nullified, the $47,328 in unauthorized transfers reversed, and the liens on my name released. Further, it read, per regulatory mandate, Mr. Alden's name has been flagged in our internal system for high-risk third-party financial activity involving non-consenting adults. Any future attempt to link accounts under similar conditions will trigger automatic referral to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. But the most profound shift came from the probate court. Not because Grandpa had died. He hadn't. But because the affidavit from Aunt Miriam and the bank's fraud report had triggered a routine review of his role as trustee for several family subtrusts, including one established for my late mother. The court didn't accuse him of elder abuse outright. There was no victim over 65 in this case. But they did issue a cautionary designation, requiring independent verification for any future disbursements he initiated on behalf of beneficiaries under 60. In practical terms, it meant his financial influence over the younger generation was legally curtailed. He could still give gifts, but he could no longer engineer obligations under the guise of generosity. I remember sitting at my kitchen table the morning the court notice arrived, sunlight streaming through the window just like it did in Grandpa's sunroom. But this light felt different. Cleaner, unfiltered. I placed the letter beside my coffee mug and just stared at it. No grand victory, no cathartic breakdown, just a quiet exhale I hadn't realized I'd been holding for 12 years. Because the real reversal wasn't just financial, it was psychological. For the first time since I was 19, I didn't have to wonder if my stability was borrowed. I didn't have to second-guess a signature, a loan offer, or a kind gesture. My name was mine again. My credit was mine. My future was mine, not as a grant from someone else's ledger, but as a right I'd reclaimed through patience, precision, and proof. And when I walked into my bank a week later to open my first solo savings account, a simple high-yield account with no cosigners, no clauses, no hidden strings, the teller smiled and said, "Congratulations, this is all you." I almost cried right there in the lobby, not from sadness, from sovereignty. The system hadn't failed me. I just needed the right receipts to make it work, and the courage to ask it too. There was no gavel, no courtroom, no public shamming, but the fallout was real, and it rippled through our family in ways both visible and quiet. Grandpa didn't lose his home or his savings. He wasn't charged with a crime. What he'd done existed in that gray space where manipulation skirts the edge of legality, never quite crossing into prosecutable fraud, but leaving deep, documentable scars. And yet, consequences arrived anyway, not with a bang, but with the slow, inevitable erosion of trust. At first, he tried to reframe it. At the next family dinner, hosted by Aunt Diane, not him, he wore his usual tweed jacket and spoke warmly about misunderstandings and bureaucratic overreach. But the room responded differently now. When he mentioned my name, there was a hesitation, a glance exchanged between cousins. Lee, who used to echo his praise of me as the one he saved, now changed the subject. Uncle Paul stopped asking Grandpa for investment advice. Even the country club stopped inviting him to chair the charity gala. They cited scheduling conflicts, but everyone knew. His reputation, once polished like the mahogany on his desk, had developed hairline fractures. Not enough to shatter it, but enough to make people look twice before handing him their trust, financial or otherwise. His power had always relied on perception, the image of the benevolent patriarch, the steady hand guiding the family ship. But once that image was questioned, even quietly, the authority dissolved. Control without credibility is just noise. Professionally, the impact was more concrete. When he tried to refinance his vacation property a few months later, the lender, unrelated to the bank that had flagged him, still ran a deep background check. They found the probate court's cautionary note and the SAR suspicious activity report filed by the financial institution. They didn't deny him outright, but they demanded a 40% down payment, double the usual, and required an independent fiduciary to co-sign. He walked away from the deal. I heard through Aunt Miriam that he muttered, "No one believes me anymore," as if the problem were their doubt, not his actions. But the most telling shift was in the silence. The phone stopped ringing. His Sunday calls to check in, once a weekly ritual filled with gentle inquiries about my progress, vanished. He didn't send birthday cards. He didn't attend my promotion dinner. Not out of spite, I think, but because the role he'd built his identity around, the rescuer, the provider, the indispensable elder, had been quietly retired by the very people he'd tried to bind to him. You can't play the hero in a story where no one believes you saved anyone. And yet I felt no triumph in his isolation, only sadness for the man he might have been if he'd learned to love without leverage. But I also felt something firmer, relief, because his consequences weren't mine to manage. They weren't my responsibility to soften or explain away. They were simply the natural outcome of choices he'd made, repeated over decades, until the pattern became too clear to ignore. In the end, the world didn't punish him. It just saw him. And sometimes, for someone who spent a lifetime curating illusion, that's consequence enough. 3 months after the sunroom meeting, a plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, but I knew the handwriting immediately. Grandpa's precise, slanted script, the same one that had signed my college acceptance congratulations and my promissory notes alike. My pulse quickened, but I didn't hesitate. I opened it right there on the porch, the morning sun warm on my shoulders. Inside was a single sheet of his monogrammed stationery. No apology, no justification, just a typed letter signed at the bottom in his hand. Eleanor, I understand you require formal separation of financial interests. Enclosed is a notarized release waiving all claims, past, present, and future, on your credit, assets, or accounts. I do not agree with your interpretation of our arrangements, but I respect your decision to proceed independently. I hope this allows us to preserve what remains of our relationship, on new terms. Robert. Tucked behind it was the notarized document itself, clean, legally sound, signed by a different notary this time, one with an active license and a reputation for integrity. No hidden clauses, no implied obligations, just a clean break. I sat on the steps and read it 3 times, not looking for traps, just taking in the weight of what it meant. He hadn't folded out of guilt. He'd folded because he'd run out of leverage, but he'd folded all the same. And in that act, however reluctant, lay an opening, not for reconciliation on his terms, but for coexistence on mine. I called Aunt Miriam that afternoon. He signed it, I said. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Good. Now you decide what relationship looks like without debt hanging between you." I thought about it for days. I could cut him off completely, no calls, no holidays, no more shared history. Part of me wanted to, but another part remembered the man who taught me to ride a bike, who read me Dickens when I was sick, who genuinely believed, however distortedly, that his control was care. I didn't owe him access to my life, but I also didn't have to let bitterness define my boundaries. So I wrote back, not a letter, just a short email, clear and kind. "Thank you for signing the release. I've filed it with my attorney. I'd be open to Sunday dinners, just the 2 of us, no financial talk, no family gossip, no expectations. If that's something you'd want too." "Eleanor." He replied the next morning, "I'd like that." We met the following Sunday at a quiet cafe downtown, neutral ground, no ledgers, no legacy on display. We talked about the weather, a new exhibit at the museum, the lilacs blooming in his garden. We didn't mention money. We didn't revisit the past. And when he reached into his coat pocket at the end, I tensed until he pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was my grandmother's locket, the one he'd taken years ago for safekeeping and never returned. "I found it while cleaning out the desk," he said simply. I took it, didn't thank him, Just fastened it around my neck, the cool metal resting against my skin like a promise kept. Grace, I've learned, isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing what you carry forward. I offered him a path back, not into my finances, not into my decisions, not into the role of savior, but into the quiet dignity of a shared past, if he was willing to leave the ledger behind. And for the first time in my life, I set the terms, and he accepted them. Not because he'd changed entirely, but because I'd finally made it clear. Love without strings isn't generosity. It's just love. The locket rests just above my collarbone now, cool and familiar, its delicate chain catching the light when I turn my head. It's not just jewelry, it's a compass. A reminder that what was taken can be returned, not through force, but through clarity. I still live in the city, but my home office overlooks a small courtyard where sunlight pools in the afternoons, much like the bay window at Grandpa's. Only this light is mine to open or close, no permissions needed. On my desk sits a new ledger, bound in soft navy cloth, filled not with debts or obligations, but with workshop outlines, resource lists, and notes from young adults who have reached out after hearing fragments of my story. I teach monthly financial literacy sessions now, free online, no registration required, focused on one quiet epidemic so many overlook: benevolent financial control. Not the flashy scams, but the slow, smiling kind that wears a cardigan and says, "I'm only looking out for you." Last week, a woman named Maya messaged me after a session. She wrote, "My father co-signed my student loans, then started making payments from my checking account without telling me. I thought I was bad with money. Now I know I was being managed." I sent her the same templates I used: the credit dispute letter, the co-signer release form, the script for talking to a bank fraud department. She replied with a single word: free. That's the real resolution, not vengeance, not exile, but freedom. And it looks different for everyone. For me, it's owning a home in my name alone. It's signing a lease without someone else's signature beside mine. It's checking my credit report and seeing only my choices, my risks, my triumphs. Grandpa and I still have those Sunday dinners, once a month, always at noon, always at the same cafe. We talk about books, the weather, Aunt Miriam's new rose garden. Never money, never the past. And when he tries ever so gently to offer advice about my career or my savings, I just smile and say, "I've got it handled, Grandpa." And he nods. Because he knows now, handled doesn't mean alone. It means accountable to myself. The motif of the ledger has come full circle. Once, it was a tool of control, hidden in a study I wasn't allowed to enter. Now, it's open on my desk, pages filled with names of people I'm helping write their own stories, legally, quietly, with receipts. What was buried is now visible. What was borrowed under false pretenses is now restored. And what remains isn't a broken family, but a redefined one, held together not by obligation, but by the quiet, hard-won choice to show up on equal ground with no strings attached. There's a quiet kind of power in knowing your own story, and even quieter strength in telling it without rage. If you've watched this far, I suspect it's because something in my journey echoed in yours. Maybe it wasn't a grandfather, it was a parent, a spouse, a mentor, but someone who wrapped control in the soft cloth of care and called it love. And maybe, like I once did, you've spent nights wondering if you were wrong to feel trapped, if you were ungrateful for questioning the hand that fed you while quietly tightening the leash. You weren't wrong, and you aren't alone. What I've learned, what I hope you take from this, is that dignity doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through a notarized letter. Sometimes it arrives in a bank statement. Sometimes it's the simple act of saying, "I need to see the original agreement," instead of signing what's handed to you. Quiet justice isn't about spectacle. It's about precision, boundaries, paper trails, and above all, the courage to trust your own perception, even when the person distorting reality is someone you love. If you're standing where I once stood, confused, indebted, emotionally entangled, I've linked a few vetted resources in the description below. Templates for credit disputes, a checklist for reviewing co-signed agreements, and a directory of nonprofit legal aid offices that specialize in financial elder abuse and family financial coercion. None of it requires confrontation, just documentation, just one step. And if you're able, leave a ledger in the comments, not just for me, but for the person reading this who needs to know they're seen. Your comment might be the first brick in someone else's bridge out. This story didn't end with a slammed door or a burned bridge. It ended with a locket returned, a ledger redefined, and a Sunday lunch where no one had to perform gratitude to earn a seat at the table. That's the kind of resolution I wish for you, not perfection, but peace. Not revenge, but restoration. Next week, I'll be sharing how to build your own caregiver paper trail if you're supporting an aging parent, because protection shouldn't come at the cost of your future. Until then, remember, your worth was never contingent on someone else's ledger. You were always whole. You just needed the right receipts to prove it, to yourself and to the world.